Hi everyone, I'm Nate Beach Westmoreland, and today I'm presenting Hacking the Voter, Lessons from a Decade of Russian Military Operations. Over the next 35 minutes, I'll cover what prompted today's talk, the importance of the information space in Russian strategic thought, how this thinking plays out in Russian military election interference operations, and what we should be doing based on these insights. As a brief introduction, I want to point out a few parts of my bio that I think are relevant to today. I have a little hands-on experience with elections, having done field organizing on the 2008 Obama for America campaign. After that youthful diversion, I did graduate research at Yale on Chinese cyber strategy and have since worked at Booz Allen on CTI for more than a decade, running several OSINT teams and presently serving as the head of strategic cyber threat intelligence. As you can see, my academic background in history and international relations is not technology. This is translated to a research focus on looking for not just the how of cyber operations, but the bigger picture why. Like, why conduct a particular operation in the first place when an adversary could be doing anything else? Why take action at any given time? Like, why release stolen documents, open breakers, or release wipers on one day as opposed to any other day once you have the ability to do so? Why use these tactics? How does this help achieve whatever goal the adversary has? What was the objective? Like, what was the point of it all? And how does this operation relate to other ones, not just in terms of tactics, but also the motivation? Today's presentation was inspired by a report my company published in March that tried to answer those questions. We synthesized more than 15 years of publicly documented activity attributed to Russia's Military Espionage and Special Forces Agency, the GRU. We wanted to figure out what the GRU was thinking. To do this, we essentially took them at their word. You see, public Russian policy documents detail the military's high-level logic and worldview. They describe what prompts the military to take action and how the military sees its tactics in advancing its mission. The GRU's mission is to identify and then neutralize or counter threats to Russian national security interests. Very long story short, the GRU has been doing essentially what the military says it's going to do. Today's presentation draws on the report's findings to narrowly look at one GRU focus: elections. Now, Russian covert election influence activities didn't start in the cyber era. The Soviet Union's intelligence agencies engaged in covert election interference as far back as the 1920s. Consider the case of Washington Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. In 1976, he ran for the Democratic Party's nomination for president. He was a Russia hardliner, and so, according to archival KGB documents, the Soviet Union aimed to derail his candidacy. At the time, the KGB frustratingly noted that he had never been involved in any major political or personal scandal. So, they went digging for dirt. They looked everywhere, even digging down records in Norway, where his family had migrated from almost 100 years earlier. Eventually, they settled on discrediting him by portraying him as being secretly gay. He had married late in life, and earlier in his career, rumors had circulated in DC that he was a confirmed bachelor, having lived with male roommates at times. So, the KGB forged several documents to confirm this narrative, including a memo from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The KGB then sent the files to newspapers and his political opponents. As far as I can tell, the files were never published, but Jackson's campaign failed to gain traction regardless. In short, Russian foreign election interference isn't new, nor are many of their fundamental strategies. What has changed is who is doing it and what tools they use. In September 1985, then CIA Deputy Director for Intelligence Robert Gates told Congress that the primary Soviet organizations responsible for foreign political influence activities were the KGB and the Soviet Communist Party's political organizing and propaganda departments. So then, the question arises, how did covert election interference become a military mission? To answer those questions, a good place to start is the late 1990s. Around this time, Russian foreign policy elites began to coalesce around a concept called informazione protivoborstvo, commonly translated as information confrontation. This argues that international relations are fundamentally a struggle between states over what is known, perceived, believed, and felt. For those of you Kremlinologists concerned with the Russian psyche, the choice of word protivoborstvo is interesting. It connotes a sense of fighting in opposition rather than a clash of two systems, suggesting a worldview of Russia responding to an informational assault. Hence, a more literal translation is closer to an informational counteraction. This struggle is continuous, existing beyond traditional concepts of delineated war and peace. For this reason, the sometimes translation of the term as information warfare can mislead about the concept, as it erroneously suggests that Russia perceived itself as being in a uniquely heightened state of conflict. A wartime battlefield clash of armies, so to speak, represents just a fraction of modern military engagement. Former Chief of the Military's General Staff Yuri Baluyevsky noted in a 2017 interview that, quote, "The victory over the enemy in this conflict can be much more important than victory in a classical military conflict because it is bloodless. Yet, the impact is overwhelming and can paralyze all of the enemy state's power structures." In short, then, international relations for Russia is a conflict over the political or national capacity to oppose, ignore, or support its agenda. Contrast this sweeping concept of a nation struggling for an advantage in the information space with the much narrower and more siloed Western concept of agencies and organizations securing cyberspace. The Russian military buys into information confrontation. Here's something they wrote in 2000 in the National Information Security Doctrine. Quote, "Information conflict is the confrontation between two or more states in the information space with the purpose of inflicting damage to information systems, processes, and resources, critical and other structures, undermining the political, economic, and social systems. A massive psychological manipulation of the population to destabilize the state and society, as well as coercing the state to take decisions for the benefit of the opposing force." Similar language has continued to permeate military documents through the present day. Furthermore, it's helpfully defined by the Russian military's website. This is why, according to its doctrine, the Russian military's responsibilities now include protecting Russian historical, spiritual, and patriotic traditions and guarding against Russian cultural strife. That's hardly the stuff of traditional Western concepts of military security, generally defined as defending against armed foreign aggression and the ability to enforce policy through the use of force. Now, Russian strategists note that the information conflict is waged with two classes of capabilities. First, informational psychological, which controls the information itself. Informational technical, which controls the systems by which information is held, transmitted, or processed. It's probably not a coincidence, then, that the two primary activity groups within the GRU, best known to the public as APT-28 and Sandworm, closely aligned with the psychological and technical capabilities. Generally speaking, then, APT-28 operations control the information environment with espionage, data leaks, and disinformation. Sandworm, however, controls the information environment with destruction and disruption. The goal of the information conflict is shaping national psyches and perceptions over the long run. For this reason, achieving quantifiable, measurable, traditional victories probably are not the whole game. What about swinging outcomes? This is probably an ideal result where some certain candidates are elected and referendums are not passed. However, in an information conflict, it needn't be the only winning scenario. Furthermore, numerous studies have shown that Moscow's likely preferred candidates have rarely won despite Russian interference. Other valuable impacts of information operations include: 1. The clash of power. Information operations undermined social cohesion and tarnished the reputation of opponents, leaders, and institutions. Thereby, Russia weakens the ability of its opponents to lead their own countries, as well as to build and lead international institutions and coalitions like the EU and NATO. Thus, by shaping the information landscape, Russia diminishes the ability of its opponents to oppose it. Second, these operations are opportunistic. They serve to periodically shape the dynamics of international relations to create new opportunities for Russian influence. Many political scientists describe international relations as being like a high-powered card game. You can peek at your opponent's cards, signal like, I have a great card, signal cards, or change the game in your favor, perhaps by shuffling the deck. I think that we're seeing Russia playing with a weak hand of hard and soft power capabilities, so it may be attempting to disrupt the fundamental dynamics where the proverbial deck can feel stacked against it. Thirdly, information operations may have a domestic angle. Remember that an information conflict is both offensive and defensive. Election interference likely in part serves to maintain the current leadership in Russia. The resulting narratives perhaps serve to signal to Russians that fair, free, and truly competitive democratic systems are not desirable, or perhaps not even possible. With these ideas of information confrontation in mind, let's see how that perspective has shaped several GRU election interference operations. In February 2014, after several months of protests, a popular uprising known as the Euro Maidan overthrew Ukraine's pro-Russia president, Viktor Yanukovych, sending him fleeing to Russia. Mass demonstrations denounced his resistance to closer EU ties and his fostering of widespread oligarchic corruption. The revolution then installed a new government that was eager to politically, militarily, and economically distance itself from Russia, immediately signaling its intention to join the EU and would soon after muse about pursuing a NATO membership. This was a huge problem for Russia. Russia declared that the new government was illegitimate. Furthermore, Moscow claimed that the new Ukrainian government was comprised of extreme Ukrainian nationalists, quote, fascists, Nazis, neo-Nazis, and anti-Semites, end quote, who would persecute ethnic Russians and other ethnic minorities. Russia promptly responded by using GRU special forces wearing unmarked uniforms to destabilize eastern Ukraine and annex the Crimean Peninsula. Well, given that Yanukovych had left the country, it was necessary to hold a presidential election, which was scheduled for May 25th. According to Ukraine's CERT, in mid-March, just as Russian forces were rolling in, the GRU began laying the technical groundwork to interfere with the election. The plan went into action just days before the election. Details of what exactly unfolded have become a little confused in available public sources, but as best as I can determine, here's what happened. On May 22nd, the GRU used a wiper with hard-coded administrative passwords to disrupt systems at Ukraine's Central Election Commission, the CEC. According to Ukraine's National Security Service, the SBU, the attackers appeared to focus on the elections analytics system used to aggregate voter data. About 20 hours later, the CEC was up and running again, having restored from backups. On the morning of May 23rd, the GRU, in the guise of hacktivist Cyber Berkut, published a statement claiming to have destroyed the CEC's vote counting system. As proof, they provided plenty of internal data, such as admin passwords and network diagrams. The Ukrainian government, about an hour or so later, issued two statements. The CEC attested that there had been some technical problems, quote unquote, in the elections and voting systems, and functionality had been fully restored. The SBU noted that they had discovered and stopped what sounds like a logic bomb that would have gone off on election day and destroyed the election's results. The SBU blamed conspirators working with the Yanukovych government for the attack. The next day, March 24th, the personal website of Interior Minister Arsen Avakov was modified with a statement about the attack. The blog post indicated that CEC vote counting systems had been destroyed and could not be recovered by the election. Nevertheless, the election could process and proceed with an entirely manual vote count. The statement blamed the situation on the criminal negligence of certain CEC officials and bemoaned the security agencies had been slow to release appropriate details. Russian government media like RT and RIA Novosti picked up on this apparent confirmation, amplifying it. Later that day, Avakov's official Facebook account stated that his website had been defaced and disavowed the content. Quote, "They posted fake statements by me about the election. It's fake, aimed at creating information chaos and disrupting the normal election process." He further noted that the CEC was functioning and the election would occur normally. Then came Election Day, March 25th. That morning, Cyber leaked emails allegedly showing an attempt by government officials to boost correct candidates in the election. The documents allegedly contained instructions to ensure the victory of an extremist Ukrainian nationalist political group affiliated with Pravy Sector, a fringe political party and paramilitary group. Election day thus proceeded. Throughout the day, the CEC's website showed various 404 not found errors. Then, between 12 and 40 minutes before polls closed at 8 p.m. that evening, the CEC website was defaced to show that, exactly as Russia and the Cyber faketivists had warned, a fringe nationalist candidate representing the Pravy Sector party had inconceivably won the election with 37% of the vote. This was impressive because he had been polling in just the single digits days earlier. The vote rigging Cyber claimed would happen appeared to have come to pass. Immediately, Russian state broadcaster Channel 1 relayed the results in a live news bulletin, further adding a sheen of authenticity. But this wasn't the end. As the manual vote trickled in that night, the GRU launched a DDoS against the vote tallying system from 1 to 3 a.m. local time, hindering the transfer of vote tallies from Ukraine's districts to the CEC, thereby further delaying the publication of the real vote. Side note, in fact, the Pravy Sector candidate had actually come in 11th place with less than 1% of the vote. In sum, Russia had dominated the information landscape through a carefully planned operation. It identified narratives that threatened the perceived fairness of the election and the legitimacy of the government, as well as issues that divided the Ukrainian people. It then took steps to seed evidence through technical and psychological means to support these narratives and hinder its opponent's ability to respond. To quote the immortal 1984 fantasy film The Dungeon Master, the GRU had declared, "I reject your reality and insert my own." In 2015, Bulgaria held a 2-round countrywide local election. At the time, the country's ruling party had taken a policy tack of distancing Bulgaria from Russia on a promise of benefits of closer alignment with the West. Earlier that year, the government had denied the Russian military access to Bulgarian airspace, citing its objection to Russia's bombing campaigns in Syria. In this context, the election was seen as a referendum on the country's ruling coalition distancing from Russia. The Bulgarian government alleges that the GRU attempted to interfere with this election. On October 25th, the first round of voting, massive DDoS attacks hit government websites. The DDoS hit the Interior Ministry, Foreign Ministry, the Central Election Commission, and the government organization that tells voters their polling station and their voter registration status. According to the Election Commission, the traffic on their website was equivalent to 65 million active sessions at once. That's mighty impressive for a country with a population of only 7 million people. The DDoS reportedly changed multiple times in apparent response to the site administrators varying their defenses, leading government officials to hypothesize that maybe insiders were providing information on countermeasures. A week later, during the second voting round, another smaller DDoS targeted the CEC and the Bulgarian president's website. In sum, these operations appear designed to block access to key authoritative sources of information about the election. As no counter-narrative appeared to our knowledge, it's possible that the attack may have variously served to frustrate Bulgarian voters, raise concerns about the legitimacy of their vote, and impose costs on their leadership. By the way, the voters rallied around the pro-Western government, expanding its representation in local governments throughout Bulgaria. In November 2016, France's centrist finance minister Emmanuel Macron joined a crowded field of candidates for the May 2017 presidential election. At the time, the leading candidate appeared to be Marine Le Pen, an overtly pro-Russia anti-EU candidate. Macron, a dark horse candidate, rapidly gained in the polls and became a leading candidate by the end of the year, just behind Le Pen. Macron had not positioned himself as being particularly anti-Russia, but he did, however, threaten Russian strategic interests by being a fervent supporter of the EU and internationalism. In December, as Macron rose in the polls, the GRU began phishing Macron's campaign, and in February, the campaign publicly accused Russia of attempting to breach its systems. Concurrently, pro-Kremlin media blasted Macron with constantly changing allegations, including, among other things, that he was secretly gay, an American spy, being supported by a global cabal of Jewish bankers. You name it. It probably didn't matter if the public accepted any given falsehood, but rather that they felt that there was something unsavory about Macron, given all these stories they'd heard. On May 3rd, an anonymous user posted documents on 4chan purporting to show that Macron had an undisclosed offshore account in the Bahamas. Le Pen referenced the documents in that evening's debate. Security researchers later assessed that the documents may have been forged or digitally manipulated versions of real documents. On May 5th, the leaker published a higher resolution version of the document, as well as 9 gigabytes of Macron campaign communications. This news was amplified on social media by leak sites, fringe political commentators, and accounts displaying bot-like behavior. Note that France has a legal moratorium on campaigning and campaign press coverage during the final 48 hours prior to national elections. The leaks went viral before that deadline. Although the Macron campaign was able to issue a brief statement before the deadline, French media were largely unable to comment on the leak. The campaign also had an informational technical opponent about which much less is publicly known. The NSA has publicly confirmed in general terms that Russian hackers had penetrated some French infrastructure related to the election. Montenegro has a complex relationship with Russia. Russia promotes the country's shared Orthodox heritage, invests heavily in many sectors, and sends tourists to account for a quarter of Montenegro's visitors. Despite these overtures, Montenegro has followed a clearly pro-West trajectory. The country is headed towards EU membership and, most relevant to this example, joined NATO in 2017. In October 2016, Montenegro held parliamentary elections that would determine whether the pro-West government would remain in power and complete its NATO membership process. Preventing the expansion of NATO is a core Russian national security concern. According to Montenegro and the United Kingdom, Russia attempted to disrupt this pivotal election. In a manner similar to what happened in Bulgaria, on the 3 days leading up to the election, Russian operators allegedly directed DDoS attacks, disrupted media websites, the country's largest telecom, Montenegrin Telecom, a democracy-promoting non-governmental organization, or NGO, that was promoting the election, and the ruling pro-NATO party. Additional unattributed DDoS attacks targeted the Montenegrin government's web portal for 2 days following the election. In addition to this, Russia attempted to manipulate Montenegro's political and social environment by allegedly funneling money into opposition political groups and seeking to coordinate with politicians, clergy, NGOs, and media outlets. Most disturbingly, the GRU allegedly planned to use political violence. Montenegro claims that the GRU had recruited Serbian nationals to dress in police uniforms and occupy parliament on the night of the election. A Russia-friendly political party would then use messaging services like WhatsApp to call upon its members to storm the building. The fake police would then fire upon the protesters, sparking an anti-government groundswell and thus prevent the real election winners from taking power. The coup thankfully didn't occur. Montenegrin law enforcement, acting on tips from several NATO countries, arrested 2 GRU officers and their agents shortly before the election. Furthermore, the Montenegrin government preemptively blocked national access to WhatsApp and Viber on election day. Now, Of course, we can't talk about GRU election interference without discussing the 2016 US presidential election. Rather than rehash all of the tactics, let's put a few in the light of information confrontation and the other examples we just discussed. The GRU used many tactics we just examined to control and manipulate the information environment around the US's election. The GRU stole emails, working documents, and other sensitive data and laundered it into the American public discourse. The group published directly through personas like CyberBerkut, DC Leaks, and Guccifer 2.0 and like-minded leak sites. The GRU also reached out to journalists, politically connected individuals, and other shapers of American public discourse who published, commented on, and amplified these leaks and the narratives associated with them. The GRU attempted to convince Americans that their elections were rigged, leaking emails from Democratic Party leaders and members of the media, which the GRU claimed was evidence of coordinated favoritism for candidate Clinton. This sure sounds a lot like those emails the GRU leaked on the morning of the 2014 Ukrainian election. The other half of this campaign, the informational technical aspects, however, I think haven't received enough attention. That summer and fall, the GRU breached or conducted reconnaissance at numerous elections infrastructure targets. Last year, the Senate's Intel Committee concluded that GRU operators had performed reconnaissance on and, in some cases, attempted to access elections-related networks and infrastructure in all 50 U.S. states. They targeted state voter registration databases, state and local voting databases, a vendor of software used to verify voter registration data, and election administration organizations and personnel. Other than exfiltrating some voter registration data, which is generally public information to begin with, there's no reporting that they did anything with their access. But the ground was set to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt about voter access and the legitimacy of the vote. Perhaps not coincidentally, that summer, inauthentic social media accounts linked to the IRA or the Russian troll farm amplified statements by leaders of American public discourse that there was going to be large-scale voter fraud and vote rigging. Finally, what does Russia do when it gets caught? In the Cold War, the Soviets often responded to foreign criticism by charging its critics with doing the same thing. You call us human rights violators? Are you not a country that lynches black people? Russia and the GRU did the same thing when Russia's state-sponsored doping program was uncovered. They leaked medical use exemptions of athletes from Russia's rivals, to which Russian diplomats literally tweeted an image of the word hypocrisy. Well, based on the Mueller report, on June 6th, the GRU intrusion at the DNC reached its high watermark, and 4 days later, the remediation phase of the breach response began kicking them out of the network. The GRU had already been caught and needed to get ahead of the news that they were interfering in the election. Perhaps not coincidentally, on June 7th, GRU front DC Leaks began leaking data from a democracy promotion group, Open Societies Foundation, which is funded by George Soros. DC Leaks noted that its data showed that, quote, Soros is named an architect and a sponsor of almost every revolution and coup around the world for the past 25 years. The USA is thought to be a vampire due to him and his puppets, not a lighthouse of freedom and democracy. Then in October, after the U.S. publicly accused Russia of interfering in the election, the GRU struck again. As CyberBerkut, it leaked data from the National Endowment for Democracy, a federally funded democracy promotion group. This leak went right to the heart of Russia's counter-narrative. According to CyberBerkut, their leaks allegedly revealed covert U.S. operations to stoke protest movements and influence elections worldwide, with an emphasis on upsetting the Russian political order. In short, the narrative is, how can the U.S. say that Russia is a bad guy for meddling in U.S. elections if U.S.-funded groups also attempt to influence elections? Now that we've looked at what the GRU has done during elections, let's consider how they could reapply their other information confrontation tactics to elections. We've shown today that Russian operations often play into existing narratives. Consider then that in the last year alone, ransomware attacks impacted more than 100 US state and local governments. We know that the GRU Sandworm group really likes to use wiper malware and has designed it sometimes to look like ransomware, such as in the NotPetya and Bad Rabbit campaigns. It would be conceivable that this scourge of criminal ransomware would provide ample cover for attacking election infrastructure like state and local elections boards. A favorite GRU strategy to authenticate and propagate disinformation is to push information through publicly trusted sources, such as government websites and the media. Well, one tactic the GRU has previously used was taking over a Maryland television station's SMS alert system, using it to send subscribers threatening text messages seen here. This technique might just as easily be used to send fake news alerts. Consider how the GRU planned to direct a Montenegrin political party to use its WhatsApp group to organize a coup in response to fabricated news. Finally, let's open the spectrum really wide. What else might be possible? The GRU has twice disrupted electric distribution in Ukraine. Would there be value in conducting such an attack, say, during an election? I don't mean like a countrywide blackout, but perhaps a low-key targeted disruption in localized swing areas. If this were a country where electronic voting machines are used, it would force a last-minute switch to paper ballots. It's easy then to imagine long lines of frustrated voters in dimly lit schools and community centers trying to vote. It may be easy to dismiss this as Russia risking massive blowback if it were to do this, say, in the United States. But what about other countries, such as Georgia, NATO, or any of the other non-NATO states with tense Russia relations? Now, how can you prepare to defend against such attacks? A good place to start is to recognize that all adversaries, including the GRU, are goal-oriented. They typically work backwards from their objective to identify the most likely pathway for success, looking for the biggest bang for their buck. Consider then what your organization has to offer. Don't take it personally. Oftentimes you may just be a pawn in a larger game. Look not just at your own internal assets like your data and platforms, but look at the role you play in delivering services or value to other organizations and the general public. Think about all of the downstream parties and processes that you impact. Then take a step back and consider what kinds of threat actors may be interested in influencing any of those organizations and operations. Many of the GRU's operations began with existing narratives. Consider the current zeitgeist that drives popular discourse, especially around elections and current polarizing hot-button issues. It's much easier to confirm something people already suspect than to introduce new narratives. The GRU often seizes on these opportunities to provide new information or amplify stories that undermine confidence in and the reputation of leaders, democratic institutions, and processes, and international partnerships. Examine how your informational assets or those of your downstream partners could be used to confirm or amplify damaging rumors, divisive narratives, and negative perceptions. Finally, look at campaigns around the world that would be considered targeting low risk or traditional targets. How are your country's adversaries already attempting to influence their own populations and their long-standing international opponents, especially those with little power to retaliate? Operations tend to be bolder when there's little chance of significant consequences, even if the aggressor is ultimately tied to the activity. See Montenegro. If you know that an actor has a capability or TTP, consider it to be fair game, potentially for use in other applications against other countries like yours. So, in conclusion, election interference isn't just about changing election outcomes. Attackers maximize the strategic value of their tactics, targets, and timing, and strategic opponents demand strategic defenses. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the talk. See, we've got a lot of questions going on in the Q&A, so I just want to tackle a few of them here. Uh, so let's see, what do we have here? We have a question about uh, what are some of the other things that have actually been accomplished here besides actually, if you're not actually getting your preferred candidates elected. Uh, so I think so we of course talked about in the presentation, there's those three categories of uh, actions that I think the GRU is targeting. But I think the most difficult question here is actually evaluating whether or not uh, the GRU, the Russian view about how to take action, whether or not it's actually having an impact. It's very difficult to say whether X caused Y. It's a classical political science problem. But to speak anecdotally, I mean, how many of us security professionals have been asked by our friends, colleagues, family, especially our families, did the Russians hack the election? And there's no actual evidence that I've seen there, votes were ever changed in this election. The real vote totals, much less in any of these other examples we looked at. But the fact that this question continues to be asked again and again, I think really exemplifies this problem that people did have they did have doubts sown in their minds, and that is a goal that we assess is of Russian election interference activities. So let's see, another question we have. Question, what is the role that the US military has in all of this? Well, I think first and foremost, it's that the US military is an intelligence arm of the United States, that is tasked among other things with monitoring the capabilities, intentions, and activities of its military competitors. So one of the critiques that you often get out of the 2016 election was that the U.S. was caught off guard. If you watch Chris Krebs's presentation earlier today, he was talking about how in 2016 there was just this general perception that there wasn't a threat here in the United States, that it wasn't anticipated. So something that the military absolutely has to focus on is identifying what is next. What are the US's foreign adversaries going to do? How are they going to do it? And how and what sort of evidence do we have that can lead us to that conclusion? And so what we need to do is look at those other countries that are already being targeted. Those what is China doing with Taiwan? What is Russia doing in Eastern Europe and in other countries? And how we can use that as opportunities to identify what are likely targets in the future, methods that are going to be used so that we can plan at a strategic level for what's next. Let's see, other questions. Let's see, we have a question about how do we deter? So deterrence is a really messy issue in the cyber community, because so much of what we're dealing with is subterfuge and espionage with a lot of not clear, bright lines. So in deterrence, it's a matter of shaping your adversary's risk calculus. So if one wanted to engage in deterrence, you need to be able to clearly state what are your bright lines, demonstrate you can attribute violations of those bright lines, and demonstrate that you are willing to follow through and take actions on violations of those bright lines. I'll leave it to the policymakers to decide what those bright lines are. But if any country wanted to engage in deterrence, you have to be able to take action on those three areas. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Do you have slides and references? This question, do you have slides and references available? This will be available after the presentation. Let's see, other countries, I think there was something about that. How to deter. Other goals. How's the U.S. considered using these techniques given perceptions of success? All right, so given the perceived success of the GRU and Russia's operations in this area, are we at risk of other national actors such as China beginning to adopt the same tactics? I believe that this is something that we absolutely need to be on the lookout for. For example, China is something top of mind for me in terms of what have its groups been potentially doing to in inter-Taiwanese relations with Hong Kong, with other countries, in terms of, say, influencing their elections, or, say, more generally about shaping the information space. In order to take like firm action, it would be nice to have some public attribution to back it up. But so, for example, the rumors about, say, the Winty group going after the nebulous Winty group, going after energy groups in Taiwan, basically whether or not they're going to engage in more destructive activities, using more GRU ways of using destructive activities in order to influence strategic calculus of their adversaries. That is something to keep an eye out on. And all right. So, thank you everyone for engaging in this talk today. If you have any more questions, reach out to me on Twitter. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Black Hats. It's been great talking with you. Thank you very much.